This question reads, Flyhigh Airlines owns exactly 2 planes, P and Q. Getaway Airlines owns exactly 3 planes, R, S, T. On Sunday, each plane makes exactly 1 flight according to the following conditions. Okay, so we have Flyhigh, we have P and Q, and then we have Getaway. We have R, S, and T. All right, so we have 5 planes, 2 different airlines, and we know each plane makes exactly 1 flight. So let's go to the rules. Rule number 1, only 1 plane departs at a time. So that means we have 5 planes going off in a sequence. Rule number 2, each plane makes either a domestic or an international flight, but not both. All right, so that tells us we're either going to have a domestic or an international flight. So if not domestic, then international. If not international, then domestic. So that's our either or. We know we have not both. So that means if we have domestic, we don't have international. And if we have international, we don't have domestic. All right, rule number 3, plane P makes an international flight. So you know P is international, so we can place an I here. Rule number 4, plane Q and R make domestic flights. So Q is domestic and R is domestic, so we can place a D here and a D here. Now, rule number 5, all international flights depart before any domestic flight. So international before domestic. So that tells us since we know P is international and Q and R are domestic, we have P before Q and R, which tells us Q and R can't be first because P has to be before them. And we know that P can't be 4th or 5th because it has Q and R after it. Now, rule number 6, any Getaway domestic flight departs before Flyhigh's domestic flight. So we know Getaway domestic is before Flyhigh domestic. Well, we know that Getaway domestic is R and Flyhigh domestic is Q. So that means R has to be before Q, meaning we can redraw this diagram here and make that P, then R, and then Q. So that tells us that R can't be 5th because R has Q after it. Now, still on rule number 6, we have 2 Getaway flights left, S and T. Now, they can either both be domestic, both be international, or one be domestic and one be international. So let's look at these options. Let's think about what would happen if both S and T were domestic. Well, if both S and T were domestic flights, then we know all Getaway domestic flights are before Flyhigh domestic flights. So the way we would draw that would be we'd still have P, which is an international Flyhigh, and then we would have all 3 of the Getaway flights because they're domestic, and domestic Getaway is going to be before domestic Flyhigh. So we'd have S domestic, R domestic, and T domestic. And then we would have Q domestic be after all 3 of those. Now this is our option if S and T were domestic. Now what if S and T were international? Well, we know from rule number 5 that all international flights are before domestic. So that would place S international, P international, and T international all before R domestic because we know R domestic is Getaway and Getaway domestic is before Flyhigh domestic. So we would have all of these guys before R domestic, and then R domestic is going to be before Q domestic because of rule number 6. Now this is the option if S and T were international. Now the last option is if one of S and T is domestic and one of S and T is international. So what would happen then? Well, we know all international flights are before domestic, so we'd have one of S or T that was international and then P that's international, and that's going to be before our R that is domestic and the other one of our ST that's domestic. And since our S and T are getaway, and one of S and T is domestic and R is domestic, we know they're going to be before Q domestic because of rule number 6. Getaway domestic is before Flyhigh domestic. So we know both of these guys are going to be before Q domestic. And this is the scenario where we have one of ST as D and then one of ST as I. So we have these 3 scenarios. And the only thing that we should really notice in common with all 3 is that all 3 of them have Q domestic as the very last flight. So we can just place that in our setup. Q is going to be our last flight and it's domestic. Okay, so those are our rules, our setup, and our deductions. Let's go ahead and hit the questions.